Hey, thank you everyone for having me and giving me the opportunity to present this work. This is the team that has been working on the project. It's been a long haul. We started this, I think, back in 2009, I think, is when we submitted this for funding, so it's been a while. But a number of different colleagues, Bill Shaw, which probably most of you in the room, if not, have not met and spoken to, know of him anyway, at Liberty Mutual Research Institute for Safety. Kelly Williams-Witt at the University of Lethbridge, actually works in the Department of Management there. And Sophie Soclaritis at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and Patrick Loisel, which most of you will know associated with the Work Disability Prevention Training Program. So this information is likely not going to be any surprise to the people here, obviously. On musculoskeletal disorders, they are a major cause of human suffering, workplace disability, lost productivity, and economic loss. Musculoskeletal disorders cause 40% of all chronic conditions, 54% of all long-term disability, and 24% of restricted activity days. So as we all know, it's a big problem in workplaces. Low back pain is the most common musculoskeletal disorder affecting working-age adults. And in the U.S., low back pain-related costs have been shown to exceed $50 billion annually in the U.S. So it's also not only debilitating for people in the workplace, but also an expense in terms of costs. So it has been shown that temporary work accommodation can actually help people get back to work. So it can facilitate early return to work. And we know that supervisors tend to be the gatekeepers and facilitators. They're the frontline person who's dealing with trying to get people back to work. But unfortunately, we don't really know the process of how the accommodations are developed, either by the supervisor or within the workplace. We don't really have a good understanding of how that happens. So the objective of this study was to try to determine the association between organizational and job type factors, supervisor characteristics, and supervisors' decisions to support workplace accommodation for injured workers with low back pain. This was the overall conceptual framework that we used for this study. So in the middle here, we have the supervisor efforts to support, recommend, or coordinate job-specific modifications. We feel that supervisors are going to have a role in that. There's going to be specific supervisor factors that will influence whether or not they're likely to provide accommodated work. Some of the things that we thought might be important are how much decision-making authority they have. If they have absolutely no authority to do anything, then it's likely they're not going to have a big influence on whether or not accommodations are provided. Their beliefs about pain. If a supervisor believes that an injured worker should really just be resting at home and not trying to get back to the workplace, then it's highly likely that they're not going to try to provide an accommodated opportunity for that individual. Also, the style of leadership. There's been a little bit of literature on leadership, not so much looking at accommodation, though, so that was something that we wanted to incorporate. And I'll talk a little bit more about the types of styles of leadership. And then we also thought there's going to be employer factors. Obviously, this is occurring in the workplace. The health and wellness culture within the workplace might have an impact. How physically demanding the job is that the particular supervisor is supervising. And the disability management policies and practices that actually go on in the workplace. That can influence what a supervisor, how likely they are to be able to provide accommodated work as well. And then in addition to that, in terms of worker factors, from qualitative work, we've seen that supervisors often will say, well, that worker, he works so hard, we want to get him back, help him as much as possible. Or you might hear another supervisor say, well, that one's sort of lazy, doesn't do a lot, not so keen on helping that individual. So we thought job tenure and commitment might have an influence. Just the overall attitude of cooperation of the worker, if they're always positive and trying to help out, might be more likely to be given accommodation. And then just basic worker attributes. Are they a really hard worker? They show up to work every day. Some of the things just about the worker. And then finally, provider factors we thought could influence as well how clear the work restrictions are provided, the familiarity that the provider might have with the workplace, and also communication with the workplace. In the particular study that I'm about to describe, we sort of held these at a constant only because we didn't really have a way of incorporating it into the study. And I'll show you that as I describe the study. So we used a cross-sectional study of supervisors. We partnered with both Canadian and U.S. employers, a total of 19. And what we did is we worked through the employer to actually invite the supervisor to participate. So we talked with the employer first and said, we were conducting this study. Would you be interested in allowing your supervisors to participate? If they said yes, what we had them do was actually send an email to their supervisors describing the study, and it took them to a link to a web-based survey, which they could complete. The supervisors had to be at least 18 years old to participate, English speaking, and had to be supervising at least one worker. So as I said, the data collection was through a web-based self-report survey, so the supervisors received this email, they clicked on the link, it took them to the survey, and then they could complete it from there. And as I said, the process for this has been long. We started in December 2010 collecting data, and we just ended data collection in January 2013. In terms of the survey design, what the supervisors were asked to do was first identify a typical job position that they supervise. So we wanted them to describe that position. Then we asked them to rate the physical job demands of that position, and then respond to different survey instruments, trying to understand how the factors might influence whether or not there'd be an accommodation for that particular type of position. We used a case vignette to conduct this study. So what we did was we provided within that, when they clicked on that link, they were taken to this website, or this web survey, and within that there was a case that was provided. And what this case described was a scenario of a low back pain injured worker who was trying to return to work. And the case went along the lines of this person's reported in that they've had a low back pain injury, they need to be off for a couple weeks, the physician has contacted you and is asking for what type of modifications you feel would be appropriate. And that particular approach, what it allowed us to do was standardize the decision-making scenario. So it was pretty much the same for all the supervisors. The only things that we varied were conditions within the vignette. So the worker's gender, so we wanted to see if male or female, if that made a difference for particular supervisors. The location of the injury, whether the injury occurred in the workplace or outside of the workplace, would that make a difference? And if the particular worker that's described in the vignette, had that individual had prior work absences or no. So those were the variables that we randomized within the vignette. So we had a total of 8 different case vignettes, and they were just randomly assigned as supervisors signed into the website. So our outcome, we used a job accommodation scale. This was what we were using to measure the likeliness of supporting job accommodations based on that particular case vignette. This was a novel instrument that was developed particularly for this study. There really was nothing out there trying to measure this prior to us writing the application for funding for this. So basically what it is, it's 21 items that represent specific different job accommodations. And so supervisors respond on a 4-point scale from 1, which is very unlikely to provide that particular accommodation, all the way to 4, which is very likely. And we found a Cronbach's alpha of 0.85, and Bill actually just recently published this paper that was trying to understand the psychometric properties of that particular scale, and also relating it, trying to understand the factor analysis of it. He conducted an exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis to try to understand what are the main overall factors that come out in terms of types of accommodations. These are the 21 different accommodations that we listed. So it ranges all the way from arrange for others to help, rotate between job tasks, avoid lifting heavy objects, ask coworkers to assist as needed. We found actually that the accommodation that was most likely to be set as being provided is avoiding the lifting of heavy objects, and the one that was the least likely was moved to a different site or location. That was the least likely accommodation to be used from the supervisors who participated. This is the results of the factor analysis, which actually shows there's sort of 5 different main overall types of accommodations that supervisors provide. One is to modify the physical workload, modify the work environment, modify the work schedule, find alternate duties, and finally arrange for assistance. The factors that we were particularly interested in, one was autonomy, as I said from our original overall idea of the study. The figure was to look at the autonomy. We modeled this question. We couldn't really find a question specific to autonomy, so we modeled it off of the job content questionnaire. We looked at we included the organizational disability management policies and practices, the 13 items from dynamics scale on disability management. The corporate safety culture scale, we used the global work safety climate scale, which is a 6-item scale. And then workplace social capital, that was a questionnaire developed by a group in Finland. We included that one, and also pain and work disability beliefs. It was measured using the pairs. And then leadership style, we measured using the leader description behavior questionnaire, which is a very long questionnaire. But what it measures is actually consideration and initiating structure. And the difference between those, consideration is more, let's work together to try to accomplish what we need to get done, where an initiating structure type of leadership style is very hierarchical, that I'm the supervisor, you will do as I say, type thing. So those were the particular factors that we were interested in measuring. Some other covariates that we considered were the physical job demands. So we used the physical workload questionnaire to try to understand if heavy physical workload and long-lasting postures and repetitive movements would influence the results in any way. And then also we included some demographic variables, supervisor age, gender, country of residence. Again, we had a US and Canadian, and education. Also the work experience that the supervisor had, anywhere from what level of manager they were, years with the company, and years as a supervisor. We looked at the number of supervised workers that the particular supervisors had, and whether or not the workers were unionized. So the statistical analysis that we conducted, we first started with the univariate and bivariate analyses, just to get an overall feel for the data. Then we used multivariable generalized linear regression, and we clustered by employer, because we figured that the supervisors that were with an employer are likely to respond similarly to other supervisors in that same employer. And this just describes our modeling approach. We started with the bivariate analysis with each outcome and each predictor, with the outcome in each predictor. And then we looked at variables that had a p-value less than 0.02, less than or equal to 0.02, and entered those into an initial multivariable model. From that, we derived reduced models, and we selected the final model based on the inclusion of the variables we considered to be the most important, predictive ability based on the R-squared, and also parsimony. We're looking for the smallest or shortest model that we could find. So, getting into some results, the overall supervisor participation rate was not good. We ended up with 26.1%, which is pretty disappointing. However, it was not that surprising. Basically, we sent emails. The employers were sending emails out to people. We did have reminder emails every 2 weeks, but these people are very busy. Supervisors generally, participating in research isn't their main goal. They have heavy burdens on them at the workplace. So I'm not surprised that a lot of people probably, if that had deleted the email, and just skipped it entirely. So although it's disappointing, we know that that's an area where we need to try to work, is try to get these individuals involved in research. Even with the low response rate, we did have 804 supervisors participate, so we still had a decent sample size. From the 19 different employers, 10 participated from the US and 9 from Canada. Yeah, move on.
So the 26.1%, was that people that logged on? Or?
That's people that completed some aspect. So they didn't have to do full completion, but at least they completed part of the survey.
Yeah, I was wondering about the length of the survey, so you took all people that actually started the survey, some people might have done.
That's right. Yeah, some people didn't finish it. Yeah. It left us, because we, again, stipulated that our included workers had to be supervising at least one worker. We lost a couple from that, and we ended up with 796 eligible in total. This is the supervisors according to the various industry sectors. So our main ones were manufacturing and also healthcare were the two main industry sectors that participated. We also had companies from utilities, education, retail, and construction. One thing I should say about this, in terms of the employer Canada-US split, the distribution was not the same across the two countries. In Canada, we got a lot of healthcare employers, and in the US, there was more manufacturing. So these are some of the characteristics of the supervisors. And this is, Yvonne, where you start to see the different numbers that actually answered some of these questions. A lot of the demographic stuff was at the end of the questionnaire, so these were the questions that were least likely to be answered. So in terms of age, we saw a mean of 45.8, a range anywhere from 19 to 69. Years as a supervisor, right around 14 years. Again, very short, to all the way up to 39 years. And years with a company, actually not that much less than actually years as a supervisor. So it seemed like most supervisors had stayed in their company for quite some time. And then in terms of U.S., we had 60% of them were U.S. residents versus Canadian residents. 73% were male versus female. 69 or 70% were frontline supervisors, so dealing right with the employees, having a direct contact. We also allowed higher level supervisors to participate, but again, there were fewer of those, only about 30% of those. And then completed post-secondary education, about 60% had done that. In terms of the number of supervisors that were or number of workers that were supervised, about 45% supervised at least 20 or more. In terms of unionization, about 55% supervised only non-unionized workplaces. The other options were partially unionized or fully unionized, but 55% supervised non-unionized. In terms of the jobs that were actually being supervised, the scores in terms of heavy physical work were about 30%, and long-lasting work postures and repetitive movements a little bit higher, around 40%. In terms of the outcome, so you'll see here we had a larger number than some of our factors look at the outcome, because that was one of the very first things they answered, and that was the job accommodation score. We ended up with a mean of 3.2 out of 4, suggesting that actually that's quite high. So my thought is, given that low response rate, it likely is the supervisors who are doing a good job of getting people back accommodated that are participating in this study. So there likely is some participation impact going on here. But overall, we did find a high level of support for job accommodations. And we looked at our various scenarios that we had, looking at different worker gender, reason for going off. And we found that there were no difference. So the JAS scores were pretty much the same across whether all those different case vignettes. So we treated all the case vignettes as a single group. So here's the distribution of the job accommodation scale responses by the type of accommodation. And you can see here that very or somewhat unlikely tended to be to modify the work schedule or find alternative duties, whereas more very or somewhat likely were to modify the physical workload, modify the work environment, and arrange for assistance. And supervisors did also have the option on the questionnaire too to say that it was not an option for their workplace, so they could put that as well. That's where it's come from. So in terms of the factors, autonomy, so how much freedom a supervisor has in actually providing the accommodations, we got a mean score of 3.7, again out of 5. So a lot of supervisors suggested that they had a fair amount of autonomy in making those decisions. Disability management policies and practices, again, quite high. So these seem to be quite well-functioning workplaces in terms of disability management. Workplace safety culture, this is actually a good score. This is reverse scores. So 1.4 is actually a good score, suggesting there's a fairly good safety culture in the workplace. Workplace social capital, 4.2 out of 5. So again, most of these were quite high scores. Our two leadership style measures, the consideration and initiating structure, again around 77-75% for both. And that's not uncommon. Actually, when we first were trying to decide what measure to use for leadership, Bill and I both took this, and we both found we ranked fairly high. We were higher on initiating structure, higher on consideration, but also had a fairly decent measure of initiating structure. So you can be high on both. It's not that you are one or the other. You can actually measure on both scales. So we saw here that all of our supervisors were fairly high on those scales. And then finally, our pain and work disability beliefs, excuse me, which we ended up with a mean score of 57.5, indicating that supervisors had a fairly positive thoughts regarding pain and work disability, that they understood that workers should not just go and lay in a bed, but they should try to get back to the workplace. However, we did find, we've been doing a little bit more analysis with this particular measure, and we found that it was not that internally consistent. This particular pairs had never actually been used in a supervisor population before. It had been used in healthcare providers. And so we were trying to take that measure and use it in supervisors, and we found that the internal consistency was not that great. So we're doing a little bit more analysis right now, trying to understand if there's some scale, some questions that we can essentially take out to modify the scale for that. So we're working on that right now. But in this particular analysis, it fell out, and that's not surprising because the internal consistency was not that high, so it's likely just an issue of reliability. So again, just those particular factors. And so this was our initial multivariable model. It included autonomy, safety culture, disability management, workplace social capital, the leadership scales, country of residence, gender, heavy physical work, long-lasting postures and repetitive movements, the level of manager, and prior work absences. That was from the case vignette, one of the ones that we wanted to see included that to see if it made a difference. And the overall amount of variance explained was 18.7%. So you can see we are not close to really understanding all the factors that are necessary in trying to understand the likelihood of a supervisor providing accommodated work. When we did our broke down our model, this was the simplest model that we came up with, our parsimonious model. And you can see here autonomy was positively related to supervisors providing accommodated work. Not a huge effect, though. The largest effect was that with disability management. Leadership consideration had a positive effect. Workplace social capital is a confusing one. We're still investigating this further because we actually found that workplaces who had supervisors who reported a higher level of social capital in a workplace actually were less likely to provide accommodated work, which seems strange. And I think something that's going on here is there's an interaction between the workplaces that participated, the different sectors, and the workplace social capital scale. So we're trying to understand that right now. So that result's not completely clear at this moment. And then also we found that Canadian supervisors were more likely to report accommodated work. And although we would like to say that Canadians are more likely to provide accommodated work, I think it's actually not that, but rather the fact that it was more the industrial sectors that participated. In Canada, we had more healthcare, whereas in the U.S. it was more management. So again, the five variables in this model explain 17.7% of the variance, and a good chunk of that variance was mainly described by the disability management policies and practices, and the consideration leadership style. So this has really been the first study to examine these multiple explanatory factors in this context. We think it's given us a better understanding of the variables that have an influence on supervisors' support for job accommodations. This has shown that organizational factors might be more important than some of the other demographic and specific job factors. And the important, or I guess one of the more promising things that we found from this is that most of the important variables seem to be potentially modifiable. So that gives us targets for potential interventions to try to actually influence supervisors' likelihood of providing accommodated work. Some of the strengths of this, we had a large number of supervisors, a range of industry sectors, and a large breadth of domains surveyed with validated measures. So I think it really builds on a gap in the literature that we really had no clue what was going on prior. In terms of limitations, that supervisor participation rate, I think, is a real limitation. However, as I said, I think we could really only generalize this work probably to the workplaces that are more high functioning. So those who have disability management policies and practices in place already, and supervisors who are functioning at quite high level in terms of trying to accommodate injured workers. These seem to be the factors that are predictive in that particular group. For those that are not as doing as well, we can't really generalize from this just because we don't have information on those individuals. It was a cross-sectional study, so again, there's no causation. We're not showing any causation here, just association. And the case vignette approach is quite hypothetical. We designed a study that would describe a situation, and supervisors had to fit their particular workplace into that. We tried to make it as easy as possible for them by having them identify a position that they supervise and then fitting that into the vignette so that they could try to just incorporate and think, okay, we're trying to make them think of an example that would have actually occurred in their workplace, but we don't know how successful we were in doing that. And so there is the potential that using the case of the vignette approach might not translate into real world activities. But we did find that supervisory support for job accommodations is influenced by several different potential modifiable variables. And really some of the things that we could do in the future would lead to develop and support disability management policies and practices. We can apply these findings to supervisor training programs. I've highlighted that in blue because that's something that we're actually doing right now. Again, we've got another joint project with the Liberty Mutual Research Institute in the States and the Institute for Work and Health on we've developed a supervisor training program and expanded on it. Actually the one that Bill Shaw developed a number of years ago. And we're trying to see if that will actually have an influence on helping supervisors get individuals back to work sooner. Also, what we'd like to do is develop another job accommodation scale, not just for low back pain, but it's also for other chronic conditions that might include cancer survivors. I don't know if you remember Ziva Mir, I think it was last fall, gave a talk at a plenary here, and he's very interested in doing this, and we've developed a potential collaboration, working on a collaboration to actually do that, and develop a job accommodation scale for other conditions. We do still need further research in this area. Again, this is the first study that's actually looked at this. It's cross-sectional in nature, so we need to confirm the study results. It would also be nice if we could get higher participation rate from supervisors, and also identify other factors. Again, we didn't explain a lot of variance in the models, so it would be nice if we could actually find out what the other factors are that would influence supervisor decisions on job accommodations. So I'd just like to acknowledge our funders. Again, this was a joint project between the Liberty Mutual Research Institute for Safety, so they funded the American portion of it, and Canadian Institutes of Health Research funded the Canadian portion. And also a very sincere thanks to Sarah McDonald, who spent hours contacting employers for us trying to find people who would participate in this study, at least on the Canadian side. And I know Bill had it, Liberty Mutual hired somebody specifically just to start trying to contact individuals to participate in this study. It's a lot of work and I think that's one of the issues that we have in work and health, trying to get employers on side, is that you can get employers to agree, they'll write you nice letters, but by the time the funding actually comes around, it's been so long ago that they've moved on and they're doing different things. So it is a definite challenge in this area.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.